For nearly 400 years, the Greek people lived under the shadow of a foreign empire. Their lands were ruled by the Ottomans, their churches silenced, and their culture pushed to the margins. But the spirit of Greece, its memory of freedom, its language, its ancient pride, never truly died. In hidden corners of mountain villages and candlelit monasteries, the old stories were still told. Stories of Leonidas, of Marathon, of a time when Greeks were not servants, but sovereign. And then, in 1821, something stirred. A spark, small at first, began to spread, not just in cities or battlefields, but in the hearts of ordinary people, fishermen, farmers, priests, and poets. They were tired of waiting, tired of bowing, and from that deep, quiet suffering came a roar that would shake an empire. This is not just a war story, it's the story of a people who remembered who they were. Welcome to Erahive, where history speaks. When the last strongholds of the Byzantine Empire fell in the 15th century, the Greek world faded into darkness, or so it seemed. The Ottomans claimed the land, the ports, the palaces, but they could not fully conquer the soul of the people. For generations, Greeks lived as second-class citizens in their own homeland. They paid heavy taxes to rulers they did not choose. Their language was discouraged, their schools few, their voices often silenced. Yet, through the candlelight of Orthodox churches and the whispered lessons of village elders, Greek identity survived. It was not loud, it did not march in the streets, but it endured quietly. Parents named their sons after ancient heroes. Children learned to cross themselves in the shadow of crumbling temples. And though they sang Ottoman songs in public, they still hummed the old ones in secret. This was not just occupation, it was a slow forgetting. And yet, somehow, they remembered. By the early 1800s, the world was changing, and so were the Greeks. Far from their homeland, in cities like Paris, Vienna, and Odessa, Greek merchants and scholars were quietly waking up to new ideas. They read Voltaire and Rousseau. They spoke of liberty, of reason, of nations born from courage rather than bloodlines. These men weren't warriors. They wore suits, not swords, but their minds were weapons, and their mission was clear: to free their people. In 1814, 3 such men formed a secret society called the Filiki Eteria, the Friendly Brotherhood. Their goal wasn't just rebellion, it was resurrection. They moved in shadows, recruiting quietly, drawing maps in candlelight, whispering codes, and planning the impossible. They believed Greece could rise again, not as a memory, but as a country. And though the price would be heavy, they were ready to pay it. Revolution, they knew, begins not with cannons, but with belief. The first flame of revolution did not rise in Athens or Sparta, but far to the north, in the rugged hills of Moldavia. It was February 1821 when Alexandros Ypsilantis, a former officer in the Russian army and a leader of the Filiki Eteria, crossed the Pruth River with a small band of men and a heart full of hope. He believed the Orthodox Christians of the Balkans would rise with him, that Russia might lend support, that this bold strike would ignite a continent-wide revolt. But he miscalculated. The people did not rise, the empires did not move, and soon his forces were surrounded, scattered, and crushed. Ypsilantis was captured, and the dream nearly died with him. Back in Constantinople, the Ottoman response was brutal. They hanged the patriarch of the Greek Church, dragging his body through the streets. To the Sultan, it was punishment, but to the Greeks, it was martyrdom, a signal, a sacrifice. And from that bloodied gate of the Patriarchate, a message spread across the Aegean: the war had truly begun. While Ypsilantis fell in the north, the true heart of the revolution began to beat in the south, in the rugged, sunburned hills of the Peloponnese. Here, the cry for freedom was not just whispered, it was shouted from mountaintops. On March 25, 1821, beneath the old banner of the cross, Bishop Hermanos of Patras is said to have raised the flag of rebellion at the monastery of Agia Lavra. Whether myth or memory, the date became sacred. Villagers took up arms, old rifles, farming scythes, anything they had, and marched under war cries not heard for centuries. Kolokotronis, a seasoned klept-turned-general, led mountain fighters into battle with fire in their eyes and the past on their shoulders. The Ottomans, caught off guard, saw garrisons fall one by one. The siege of Tripolitsa, the Ottoman stronghold in the Peloponnese, ended in blood and smoke. What followed was grim, massacres that scarred the land. But to the Greeks, it was justice for centuries of suffering. The revolution had found its fury, and the world could no longer look away. While battles raged on land, another war unfolded across the waves. The Greek islands, Hydra, Spetses, Psara, had long been homes to merchants and sailors. Now they became warlords of the Aegean. These were not navies in the formal sense. Their ships were cargo vessels, their captains self-taught, their fleets cobbled together from the bones of trade. But they fought like men with nothing to lose, and they had a secret weapon: fire ships, loaded with explosives and steered by volunteers willing to die. These boats would drift silently toward Ottoman warships before erupting in flame and thunder. It was chaos, it was desperation, and it worked. The Ottoman fleet, massive but rigid, struggled to contain the fury of these island fighters. At sea, Andreas Miaoulis and the legendary Laskarina Bubulina, one of history's few female admirals, carved their names into Greece's story with smoke and steel. The war on the water was brutal and uneven, but it gave the revolution a lifeline, one burning hull at a time. In the spring of 1822, the revolution reached the island of Chios, a jewel of the Aegean, known more for its orchards and scholars than for rebellion. The people of Chios had not risen. They had lived quietly, cautiously, under Ottoman rule. But when a small band of revolutionaries from nearby islands landed there, urging revolt, the balance shattered. The Ottomans responded with fury. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. In just a few days, over 20,000 Greeks were killed, tens of thousands more enslaved or exiled. The island's villages burned. Its streets ran red. The world recoiled in horror. But from this tragedy came something the Greeks had long hoped for: attention. Across Europe, artists painted the massacre, newspapers printed the horror, and poets wept for a place they'd never seen. Eugene Delacroix captured it on canvas. Lord Byron sharpened his pen. The massacre of Chios awakened a sleeping Europe, not just to pity, but to purpose. What had been a distant rebellion now felt like a moral crusade. The Greeks were no longer just rebels. They were martyrs, and the world began to ask, how long can an empire crush a people before the world says no? Even as the revolution burned brightly, cracks began to form from within. Victory had come swiftly in some regions, but so had pride, ambition, and rivalry. Greece was not a single army or a united front. It was a fragile web of clans, captains, island leaders, and politicians, each with their own vision of freedom. As the Ottoman threat loomed, the Greeks turned inward. Disputes over leadership, strategy, and foreign aid turned brothers in arms into bitter rivals. Two civil wars broke out between 1823 and 1825, draining men, money, and morale. While Turkish forces regrouped, the Greeks fought each other on land they had bled to liberate. For the ordinary fighter, it was heartbreaking. Men who once shared bread in the hills now met as enemies on the battlefield. The dream of freedom was stained by ego, mistrust, and betrayal. Leaders like Theodoros Kolokotronis, once hailed as heroes, were imprisoned by rival factions. It was a dark and confusing time, a reminder that even the most righteous revolutions can falter, not from the strength of their enemies, but from the weakness of their own divisions. And while the Greeks turned their swords against each other, far to the south, a greater storm was forming. Egypt was coming, and it would not show mercy. As Greece tore itself apart with civil strife, the Ottoman Empire called upon its most fearsome ally, Muhammad Ali of Egypt. In return for promises of land and power, the Egyptian ruler sent his son Ibrahim Pasha to crush the Greek revolt once and for all. Ibrahim was not like the sultans of Constantinople. He was modern, ruthless, and methodical. In 1825, he landed in the Peloponnese with a trained army, disciplined cavalry, and a fleet to match. What followed was not war, it was devastation. Village after village was burned, fields were salted, children were taken as slaves, survivors were driven into the mountains. This was not just a campaign of conquest, it was an attempt to erase the Greek people from their own land. The revolution, once fueled by passion and unity, now faced total collapse. Greek fighters, exhausted from years of war and betrayal, found themselves retreating, defeated, scattered. Yet, even in ruin, something held. Kolokotronis, released from prison, returned to rally resistance in the mountains. Guerrilla warfare became the last line of defense. Across the Aegean, islanders begged for help, and cries rose from the ashes of once proud towns. The Greeks had lost ground, but not their will, and far beyond their borders, the world was watching. The storm that Ibrahim unleashed would soon wake the giants of Europe, and for the first time, the fate of Greece would not be fought alone. As Ibrahim's scorched earth campaign spread terror across Greece, the cries of a dying revolution reached the ears of Europe, and this time they did not fall on deaf ones. Across the continent, the Greek cause had become more than politics. It had become poetry, romance, morality. In salons and universities, people spoke not of rebels, but of heroes, of Thermopylae reborn, of a Christian nation resisting tyranny. The movement had a new name, Philhellenism, the love of Greece, and its supporters came from every corner of Europe. The most famous among them was Lord Byron, the British poet, who had written of Greek glory and then gave his life for it. He sailed to Greece, spent his own fortune funding soldiers, and died in the muddy town of Missolonghi in 1824, not from bullets, but from fever. His death was mourned like that of a king. Public pressure grew, and finally, the great powers, Britain, France, and Russia, decided to act, not only out of sympathy but out of strategy. A weakened Ottoman Empire was a chance to shift the balance of power. In 1827, the three nations signed the Treaty of London, demanding peace and Greek autonomy. The Sultan refused. The Allies responded. Warships set sail, not just to observe, but to intervene. The fate of Greece was no longer just in Greek hands. The age of diplomacy was ending. The cannons would speak next. On the quiet afternoon of October 20th, 1827, in the sheltered bay of Navarino, three great fleets, British, French, and Russian, confronted the combined Ottoman-Egyptian navy. Officially, they were there to enforce peace. Unofficially, everyone knew what was coming. The bay was calm, the skies clear, but the water beneath hid enough gunpowder to change history. The Allied commanders had no intention of starting a fight, but in a moment of confusion, a single shot rang out, then another. Within minutes, diplomacy dissolved into chaos. The narrow bay became a furnace. Cannon fire thundered across the water. Masts snapped. Flames rose from hulls. One after another, Ottoman and Egyptian warships were torn apart by relentless volleys from the Western powers. Greek sailors, watching from the shore, wept, not in fear, but in awe. The gods of the sea, it seemed, had returned. By nightfall, the Ottoman-Egyptian fleet was annihilated. Over 60 ships sunk or disabled, thousands dead. The Allied forces had not lost a single vessel. It was one of the last great naval battles fought entirely by sailing ships, and it reshaped the war. Ibrahim Pasha's army, cut off from supply lines, lost its power. The Ottoman Empire, humiliated, could no longer pretend it held control. And for Greece, Navarino was more than a military victory. It was a miracle. The tide had turned. The world had chosen a side. And now, nothing could stop the march toward freedom. The guns fell silent, but the struggle was far from over. Greece, though delivered from the jaws of Ottoman destruction, was a land broken, its villages burned, its people scattered, its heroes divided. What remained was not a nation, but the ashes of one. Into this fragile moment stepped a man of vision and burden, Ioannis Kapodistrias. A diplomat by trade, once a minister in the Russian Empire, he now became the first head of a free Greek government. He arrived not with soldiers, but with structure. He built schools where there had only been ruins. He issued currency. He sought to tame warlords and unite the shattered provinces under one flag. But Greece was wild with grief and ambition, and not all welcomed his order. The very men who had once fought for freedom now bristled at the idea of being governed. They wanted liberty, but on their terms. Factions stirred, daggers returned to belts. Suspicion filled the silence. In 1831, just 3 years into his rule, Kapodistrias was assassinated, shot on the steps of a church by a fellow Greek. It was a tragic symbol. The father of modern Greece, felled not by an empire, but by his own countrymen. And yet, from this chaos, the idea of Greece endured. The dream had been bought with blood, and it would not be undone. After years of rebellion, war, betrayal, and foreign intervention, the world finally recognized what the Greeks had always known, that their fight was not rebellion, but a rightful return to freedom. In 1830, through the London Protocol, the great powers, Britain, France, and Russia, formally declared Greece an independent state. For the first time in nearly 400 years, the name Greece was no longer just a memory, it was a country. But independence came with conditions. The powers, wary of republicanism and instability, decided that Greece would not be a republic, it would be a kingdom. And so, in 1832, a young Bavarian prince, Otto of Wittelsbach, was placed on the newly created throne. At just 17 years old, King Otto I of Greece arrived in a land still bruised and burning with unresolved hope. He spoke no Greek, he brought with him foreign advisors, yet the people, exhausted by war, welcomed the promise of peace. The borders were modest, only a fraction of ancient Hellas was included. But to the Greeks, this was a beginning, a foothold, a chance. Children born after 1832 would grow up in a country their grandparents had only dreamed of. The fires of revolution had become the light of a new dawn, and though struggles remained, the soul of Greece had survived the centuries. Now, at last, it had a flag of its own. The Greek War of Independence did more than redraw borders. It reawakened a civilization. For centuries, Greece had lived only in the pages of history books and the ruins of marble temples. But through the fire of revolution, it stepped out of myth and into modernity. The war became a symbol, not just of national struggle, but of what ordinary people could achieve when memory became purpose. It was not led by kings or empires, but by fishermen, priests, poets, and farmers who refused to forget who they were. Its echoes rang across the Balkans, where other nations under Ottoman rule began to dream of their own freedom. It inspired movements, revolts, and revolutions across Europe. It showed the world that empires could fall, and that even the smallest nations could rise if their cause was just and their spirit unbroken. But Greece's journey was not over. The new kingdom was only the beginning. For decades to come, Greeks would fight to unite the scattered lands where their language and cultures still lived. Thessaly, Epirus, Macedonia, the islands, and Crete. The idea of Megali Ellada, the Great Greece, would become a rallying cry for generations. Yet no matter how far the map stretched, the true victory was already won. Greece was no longer just an ancient memory. It was a living, breathing nation, born in suffering, forged in hope, and carried forward by the unshakable belief that a people who remember their past can always fight for their future. And so, from forgotten villages to the halls of kings, from fire ships to mountain strongholds, the Greek War of Independence became more than a fight for land. It became a testament to the resilience of a people who refused to be erased. Their revolution lit a spark that spread far beyond their shores, reminding the world that history is not only written by the powerful, but by the brave. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most defining struggles of modern Europe. This is Era Hive, where history speaks.